Hello, my name is Nicole Findlay. I'm a third-year OBGYN resident at Metro Health Medical Center. My project is on increased IUGR detection using fetal 5 volumes when estimated fetal weight is 10th to 20th percentile by Hadlock method. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Autumn Brenninger, a former co-resident, and my faculty mentors, Dr. Chen and Dr. Gibson, who helped make this project possible. Intrauterine growth restriction, otherwise known as IUGR, is long known to be associated with adverse obstetric and pediatric outcomes. An antenatal diagnosis is ideal, but relies on an accurate estimated fetal weight. Typically, estimated fetal weights are calculated using two-dimensional measurements and formulas like Hadlock. However, the systematic error in these formulas mean that up to 25% of these fetuses at the 20th percentile are in fact IUGR and not appropriately grown. As a result, fetuses in the 10th to 20th percentile by a two-dimensional estimated fetal weight are at high risk of being misdiagnosed. This makes this group an ideal target for the application of a three-dimensional volumetric formula, which may improve accuracy. This is exactly the objective of this study, to determine if adding three-dimensional fractional 5 volume for fetuses with a two-dimensional estimated fetal weight in the 10th to 20th percentile will increase detection of intrauterine growth restriction. To study this, we conducted a retrospective cohort study. Metro Health instituted a protocol starting in January 2017 to incorporate 5 volume for fetuses with a two-dimensional estimated fetal weight in the 10th to 20th percentile by Hadlock method. And if the 3D weight was less than 10th percentile, then we would manage these fetuses as IUGR. So practically, this means applying a routine Hadlock biometry and then adding in the volume for the mid portion of the fetal thigh, as seen in this picture. On ultrasound, this is what those images look like. You get your femur length, and then you take the circumference of 5 cross sections of the mid thigh, and those get plugged into a formula, and you get your 3D estimated fetal weight. To assess the impact of this intervention, we collected data on all fetuses with a two-dimensional estimated fetal weight less than or equal to the 20th percentile for all of 2017 and 2018. Then we excluded those with prior IUGR diagnosis, multiple gestations, anomalies, technically limited studies, fetal demise, and those who delivered outside our health system where we couldn't collect their delivery outcomes. As with the implementation of any new protocol, uptake is not 100%. The intervention group were those who had thigh volume performed. The control group were those who did not. In both groups, IUGR diagnosis could still be made at later gestations if follow-up biometry was performed for other indications. So this is how we assess whether it was the thigh volume intervention itself that improved the detection rate, or if those at risk for IUGR would just eventually be diagnosed due to follow-up biometry for other indications like advanced maternal age, obesity, chronic hypertension, etc. The analysis included routine descriptive statistics, test performance indicators like sensitivity, specificity, positive and negative predictive value. Then we looked at the rate of IUGR diagnosis and resource utilization between groups and how this affected delivery outcomes. So our results. 314 subjects total were included, all of which were 10th to 20th percentile by 2D estimated fetal weight. 54% of these subjects were born IUGR, 27% were born severe IUGR. And so, as hypothesized, this borderline growth group was at very high risk of becoming IUGR. We had 189 in the intervention group and 125 in the control group. For most antenatal variables, there were no statistically significant differences between the groups. Here's an overview of our descriptive stats on the variables that were similar in both groups. So we have age, race, BMI, parity, smoking, hypertension disorders, diabetic disorders, all similarly distributed amongst the intervention and the control groups. There were only 3 antenatal variables with significant differences, and this was gestational age at index scan, the attending supervising the index scan, and the Hadlock percentile at the index scan. The control group had a higher percentage of scans performed before 28 weeks. This was because it would include some of those late presenting anatomy scans. They were far enough along at the anatomy scan that a percentile was calculated, but typically at anatomy scans, thigh volume measurements just were not performed. They were mostly done at follow-up biometry scans. And so that's why the control group had more of those early gestations. The uptake of the protocol also varied amongst the supervising attendings. However, most of our thigh volumes were all measured by the same group of ultrasound techs, regardless of whichever attending was supervising the center at the time. So this should not impact that user-dependent accuracy of ultrasound measurements. Lastly, those with a two-dimensional estimated fetal weight at exactly the 10th percentile were often managed as IUGR, and those that were exactly the 20th percentile were often managed as appropriately grown. So at both ends of the range, the utilization of the protocol was lower. With a cutoff at less than 10th percentile, the sensitivity was 70%, specificity was 54%, positive predictive value was 68%, and negative predictive value was 56%. If the cutoff is then increased to less than 20th percentile, the sensitivity is as high as 95%. So, what does this mean for detection rates? Well, in short, it means double the detection. In the intervention group, 64% of infants who were born with birth weight less than 10th percentile had an antenatal diagnosis. 75% of those born with a birth weight less than 5th percentile had an antenatal diagnosis. In the control groups, those percentages were only 29% and 37%. So how does this impact the use of resources? Well, yes, this means more ultrasounds being performed. In the control group, only 32 of 125 subjects had antenatal surveillance. But this also meant that 42 out of 59 of infants who were born IUGR by birth weight had no antenatal diagnosis. So we were missing a lot of IUGR. In the intervention group, 108 of 189 had antenatal surveillance, so this was definitely more. However, it was proportional to the true rate of IUGR, which was really 111 of 189. So there were more ultrasounds being done, but it was proportional, and with the sensitivity and specificity of the intervention, we were able to double our detection rate. So what does this mean for delivery decision making? Well, 77 of the 314 subjects were delivered primarily for IUGR. There were more of these IUGR indicated deliveries in the intervention group versus the control group. However, these decisions were reasonable. 79% of the infants in the intervention group who were delivered primarily for IUGR were actually IUGR by birth weight. And even in the control group, that number was 70%. And then you'll see that there were very few indicated IUGR deliveries that happened to be preterm. So the decisions to deliver for IUGR were overall quite appropriate. And now looking ahead to future directions, well, this was a retrospective cohort study and not prospective or an RCT. But, it was fairly recent data, and all of the variables we needed were pretty readily available. One future direction with this research would be to look at ways to differentiate constitutionally small fetuses from those with pathologic growth restriction, perhaps incorporating fetal Dopplers or neonatal body composition. But in summary, adding thigh volume may increase your detection rate of IUGR by as much as double. In those with a two-dimensional estimated fetal weight between the 10th and 20th percentile. And the sensitivity of using it at the less than 20th percentile is actually 95%. So while those in the 10th to 20th percentile by 3D volume shouldn't be managed as IUGR, they should definitely have follow-up biometry because this is still a high-risk group. And then increasing the antenatal surveillance for this, it was definitely worth it. We did have some more deliveries indicated for IUGR, but it was very proportional to the true rate of IUGR. So here are my references, and thank you so much for your time.